Russia announced on Monday that it has started preparing for nuclear weapons exercises near Ukraine, accusing Western officials of making provocative statements and threats by deepening their support for Ukraine. Now, last week, French President Macron hinted at deploying French troops, NATO troops, in Ukraine, while UK's David Cameron said that Ukraine had the right to use British weapons for strikes within Russia. Now, what are going to be the implications here? Because Russia is not a nation which is not going to respond to this. And in terms of rhetoric, in terms of statements, in terms of a borderline threat, they already have. For more on this, we're being joined by Ben Aris, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews and also former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph, joining us live from Berlin. Always a pleasure speaking with you, Ben. And I wanted to just now understand, Macron has made this statement in February that he does not rule out the chances of NATO troops operating in Ukraine. And soon after that, most NATO heavyweights, they came forward and they distanced themselves from Macron's statement of sending NATO troops to Ukraine. Now, again, he's made a similar comment. Is France ready for a confrontation with Russia? Because that's what Russia has said, that if France goes ahead with this, that's what it means.
Yeah, to unpack this, what's going on, it's a delicate game of diplomatic fencing. So in principle, Macron's right that the West, NATO, cannot take off the table the possibility that it will send troops of its own, NATO troops, into Ukraine to fight against Russia. The point being is, if they do take that off the table, then that gives a sort of bound to what NATO will do. It gives an upper limit to the threat that it can make. And in Putin's calculation, then he gives him carte blanche to a certain extent to put as many troops as he likes into Ukraine. Because they haven't done a mass mobilization, they could significantly scale the operation up. At the moment, it's been very restrained because the Ukrainian army is weaker than the Russian army. But if you take the possibility of NATO off the table, then Russia has a free hand. So in principle, Macron's right to make that threat. The problem is that no one in NATO is prepared to do that because they don't want to risk a full confrontation between NATO and Russia. In other words, Third World War. So they're very reluctant. So in practical terms, everybody immediately withdrew from that or said they're not going to do it. But then that brings in the nuclear card, because the reason why NATO doesn't want to get into a full confrontation with Russia is the threat that it will turn into a nuclear exchange. And so now Macron has repeated those threats that, French might send some troops. Immediately, Putin is playing his card and rattling his nuclear saber by ordering these exercises to remind everybody in NATO exactly why they don't want to go into a direct confrontation with Russia. And so that's what this is all about. I don't think there's any immediate danger of there being a Russian nuclear strike in anywhere, particularly not in Ukraine. Nevertheless, Putin is just making the point, this is the problem, this is the danger, this is his trump card.
When you talk about his trump card, any time that we've seen any kind of an escalatory comment or a statement coming in from the West, it's almost seeming like a knee-jerk reaction from Russia to press down on their trump card or to make some kind of a nuclear statement which suggests nuclear saber rattling. It's almost becoming traditional of Russia to be doing that. And Ukraine, in as many words, said it that we're used to it and it's just Russian blackmail. Do you think it's just blackmail, or does Russia really have it in them to escalate it to that point?
Well, that's the key question. I mean, push comes to shove, would Putin be prepared to fire a nuclear missile at, whoever, Ukraine in particular? And as I said, I mean, this is like, diplomatic fencing. It's a game that they play, a very high stakes game. And Putin's rattled his nuclear saber. But what scares everybody is that given in this conflict, Putin at every stage has gone to the most extreme possible response, up to and starting with the actual invasion of Ukraine itself. No one was expecting that. All us Russia watchers have been doing it for years. I think universally we were caught out and didn't expect him to do that. It was a very extreme response. And I think now with the recalibration we've had with Putin is that he is prepared to go as far as it takes. And that, the chances of him firing a nuclear missile is non-zero. And, to put some context on that, Russia has these tactical nuclear weapons, but it actually has some very small ones, about 0.5 kiloton. The smallest the Americans have is 5 kilotons. And a small half-kiloton nuclear weapon would do something like destroy downtown Kiev, but not the entire city. In other words, it's the power of a very large conventional bomb. And if he was to use one of those, that opens up the very tricky debate whereby people would say, well, look, it hasn't done that much damage. It's only sort of taken out a few blocks or a region in downtown Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so that doesn't warrant a nuclear mutually assured destruction exchange. So he could fire one of those tactical nuclear missiles and call the West bluff, and the West would balk at the full exchange, which would destroy everybody and kill everything. And they would pull their punch, and the argument would come up as like, well, it was only actually kind of a small bomb, big as a conventional weapon, so we'll ignore it in order so that, you know, we can all stay alive. And would Putin do that? I don't think you can rule it out. I wouldn't say it was probable, but nevertheless, it's at least very possible. So and Putin, I think, would do something like that. Go ahead.
Yeah, France can't. I mean, as you said, that Macron is within his rights to say that you can't rule out the possibility of NATO troops entering Ukraine, and at the same time, as you mentioned, that you can't rule out the possibility of Putin pressing that nuclear button and perhaps using a nuclear weapon of smaller capacity aimed at a strategic space within Ukraine. But I also wanted to just shift focus now to a statement which came in from the UK, and it is a departure from the initial stance. We're witnessing such statements from the UK's foreign minister, which is different from earlier, and it's not allowing UK missiles to be used inside Russia. That's what they said earlier. But now Cameron said that, okay, yes, these weapons can be used to target spaces within Russia. What message is Russia sending back to the West with these military drills now that UK has kind of made this a departure from its earlier stance?
Again, it's another thrust by Cameron, suggesting that Ukraine could use some of its long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia. And the riposte from the Russian, the foreign ministry yesterday was that if, say, a UK missile hit a target, oil refinery deep in Russia, then the Russians would take that all UK military facilities inside Ukraine and specifically outside Ukraine become legitimate targets. Mm-hmm. And what they're suggesting is that there would be, if one of these missiles was used to hit, say, an oil refinery in Samara, then the Russians would retaliatory strike and hit a UK target, a base in Germany, a ship in the North Sea. They'd hit something outside of Ukraine with their own missiles. So what this is part of the creeping escalation we've seen. I mean, Macron's threat to send NATO troops into Ukraine is an escalation. Cameron's comments that Kiev could use one of its UK missiles to hit targets inside Russia is another escalation. Interestingly, Ukraine itself said yesterday that they would not use NATO missiles to hit targets in Russia. And since January, they've been striking Russian oil refineries deep into Russia's territory, but they've been using specifically homemade Ukrainian drones. They haven't used any Western armaments because everyone understands if they were to use an American-made missile or a UK-made missile, that would be, again, another escalation, and Russia would respond. It's more diplomatic fencing.
Ben, now Russia calls it a dangerous rhetoric for Western nations. They're planning nuclear drills in the southern military district, which borders Ukraine. Now, if one looks at the map, that southern military district of Russia, it is right next to Ukraine. But what is also next to Ukraine is Belarus, and what's also next to Ukraine is Kaliningrad. And in all these three positions, you have Russia carrying out military drills, nuclear drills in the southern military district, and they already have their nuclear assets parked in Belarus and Kaliningrad, as for most sources. Ukraine, for the most part, apart from the soldiers and the troops which are already inside Ukraine, is surrounded by nuclear weapons which belong to Russia. Ukraine really doesn't have any chance when it comes to, if Russia decides to go ahead with some kind of a nuclear military response. How far do you feel Ukraine should be pushing it when it comes to targeting, key strategic spots within Russia the way they have been, even if it's using their own homegrown drones?
We're creeping up towards the red line. I mean, each of these escalations takes us closer and closer to the point where there's going to be an escalation to the point where Ukraine looks like it's going to collapse, and NATO has to make a choice about going in or not. And at the same time, you can see that Kiev is extremely frustrated. They just got this new $61 billion package from the States. However, they have run out of weapons already since February, the fall of Avdiivka. And the skies are open. Russia has destroyed half of Ukraine's power facilities. The winter this year is going to be appalling. People are back in bomb shelters as the cities are being hit on a daily basis with a barrage of Russian missiles. And what can Ukraine do? So the only thing it's got left that's effective is its long-range drones. And so they're hitting back and targeting, oil refineries, but increasingly military factories and anything they can get their hands on inside Russia. And they're doing that out of desperation because they're actually conceding grounds Russia, on the battlefield. Russia's making advances in Donbass now, which it hasn't really done for much of the last 2 years. And Ukraine is like hitting back with anything that it's got while it waits for more American weapons to arrive. But at the same time, the more it strikes inside Russia, the Russians will retaliate. And Putin's turning the screws very hard now. I mean, the offense has gone up a notch because he's trying to take advantage of this window where Ukraine is relatively defenseless. They also run out of the crucial 155mm shells, and Russia's raining down 10 times the amount. And Russia's economy is on a full war footing. Shoigu, the defense minister, said the other day that Russia's now producing more weapons, more ammunition than it needs. It's now sending the extra to warehouses. And yet the EU, the West, have not invested in the new production facilities. And so they're actually incapable of supplying Ukraine with the weapons, even if they wanted to. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to their own stockpiles. Patriot missiles, the Americans have put those on the list for resupply, but it's not sending any from its stockpile. It sent orders to factories. So those missiles won't appear for, I don't know, until June. So there's still several months going on. And in the meantime, Zelensky's doing what he can, which is, to cause chaos. But at the end of the day, it's not actually affecting the Russian economy. The Russian economy is flourishing, partly because of all this military spending. It's doing very well. So they're well armed, well supplied, well funded, whereas Ukraine is undersupplied, broke, struggling to pay for both weapons and the military salaries. And the situation is dire. This whole year is going to be a nightmare for Ukraine. And the strategy now is just to muddle through somehow in the hope that, Europe's arms production comes online next year, that this money that's been sent arrives fairly soon in the summer and stabilizes the situation so that they can think about a counteroffensive starting in 2025.
And it's actually not just the arms that is the problem at the moment. While they still wait for the arms to finally make it to the front lines in Ukraine, they are also heavily outmanned. That is another issue which Ukraine is facing. And of course, we are tracking the developments closely right here on WION World is One. Thank you so much for joining in, Ben. That was Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, and also former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph, joining us from Berlin. Always a pleasure, Ben.
My pleasure.